Did you enjoy the film? All right. We are going to get started. I'm going to introduce the panelists. It's going to be a rousing, incredible discussion. This film was incredible. It brought back a lot of memories. We're going to talk about it. Let me first bring out to the stage renowned presidential historian, Cold War scholar, and CNN presidential historian, currently serving as a senior research scholar and adjunct professor at my alma mater, Columbia University. Let's welcome Timothy Naftali. Welcome. All right, next up, acclaimed writer, director, producer, and storyteller. I mean, this beautiful piece of storytelling has come from the work and the mind of one man who helped shape some of television's most compelling dramas, including Designated Survivor, Billions, The Thai Cave Rescue. As writer and director of The Brink of War, he brings his distinctive vision to this extraordinary moment in history. Please welcome Michael Russell Gunn, the director and writer of Brink of War.
Hey.
Yes, good to see you. An extraordinary actor, one of Britain's most acclaimed actors. Jared Harris has developed and delivered an unforgettable performance in Mad Men. Oh, remember Lane? Everybody remember Lane Price in Mad Men? Yes. The Crown, where he played George VI. Chernobyl, international acclaim. Yes, what a wonderful film, and a BAFTA award in The Brink of War. He brings his remarkable depth and intensity to the formidable role of Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev. Please welcome Jared Harris. And next up, an extraordinary actor, musician, and playwright who has captivated audiences for more than 5 decades, from the Purple Rose of Cairo and The Squid and the Whale to his Emmy Award-winning performance in The Newsroom, which has sort of become like, it's a weird like echo chamber that we are more like Will McAvoy now than we were before Will McAvoy. And Godless. In The Brink of War, he brings his extraordinary range and commanding presence to the iconic role of President Ronald Reagan. Please welcome Jeff Daniels.
I don't know.
Right there.
Hey, Jeff, you're here.
Mr. President.
Yes, you go, Mr. President.
Go, Mr. President. Down there.
Well, thank you all. So we were just chatting backstage about how wonderful this piece of art is. And for me personally, as somebody who remembers that period of time, I was in high school, but also growing up with a name like Vladimir at the height of the Cold War, wasn't easy until these two men were elected to, well, Gorbachev wasn't elected, but when President Reagan came to office and Mikhail Gorbachev became the general secretary, this was an incredibly powerful moment for me to witness. A lot of what I saw on the screen there is what inspired me, even as a young man, to want to be a journalist, to be able to cover and to see from the front row of history events like that was what inspired me to do what I do now. So, Michael, I want to start with you and ask you, I mean, you're younger than me. What compelled you to want to tell this story? And Timothy and I were talking at the end how it was so beautiful to see that tribute to Secretary George Shultz at the end of the film. People forget how towering of a Secretary of State he was and what kind of life he dedicated to public service. Yeah. How did this idea come to you?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's there because I owe him. I mean, I think we all owe him, but he, yeah, absolutely. So the abridged version is just that I had written a different project that involved Sam Nunn and Dick Lugar. It was the Nunn-Lugar Amendment, if anybody's familiar with this. And so that fell apart. That didn't work out in Hollywood fashion. But Bill Perry, who wrote the book, was very generous and said, why don't you come up to Stanford and meet George Shultz? And I wasn't going to turn that down. And so I did, and he, in the conference room at Stanford, is an oil painting of that room with Reagan and Gorbachev facing off. And that was a visceral image, if you can imagine, of these two people sitting in a room. And he started to tell the story. And we started talking and talked more. And he was very generous with his time and very grandfatherly. And he said, you really want to do this? And I said, yeah, I think I want to write this movie. And he was like, well, how are you going to make money? Like, well, you have a wife and kids at home. Like, how are you going to make money? Go home and talk to your wife. And then I was like, okay. And I went home and talked to my wife, and I called him back, and I said, I really want to do the movie. And so he started sharing his stories, and that was the origins of it.
When you were thinking about casting,
Yeah.
Ronald Reagan is, for a president like Ronald Reagan, who in the public image loomed larger than life, even before he became president as an actor and a governor, and for Mikhail Gorbachev, who sort of galvanized, certainly here in the United States, the way we thought of Soviet leaders. What were you thinking about when it came to casting? And in working with Jeff and Jared, how did you direct them so that what we saw on the screen wasn't an impersonation, but more of an embodiment of who these two figures were?
Well, in terms of the casting, I knew Jeff from the newsroom, and I had seen him. I'm sorry, Jeff, slightly younger, so I knew the arachnophobia. I knew arachnophobia. I knew Dumb and Dumber. I knew those things.
Yes,
and then,
Well,
so
Big hits.
yeah, the hits, and then
Huge movie.
So I admit I'm embarrassed in my cinema history. I did not yet know Purple Rose of Cairo in terms of endearment and all these things, but I saw him on the newsroom and thought, what the heck is happening here? This is the same guy. And so knowing he could do what he did with Sorkin's dialogue and everything was obviously impressive. And I think that, so I knew he could do it. The question was, did he want to do it? And so I wrote him a letter and said, Dear Mr. Daniels, you probably won't remember me from the newsroom. And so we got on a Zoom, and he said, yeah, I don't remember you at all. So, yeah, and then in the case of our friend Jared over here, that was, I would say, there's a kind of theory, I think, sometimes amongst casting directors. My casting director, Sheila, is here tonight, and that sometimes the person finds the role. In our case, this was a suggestion made by an agent, and the second I heard it, he got a laundry list of amazing credits that you guys all heard, so Chernobyl, all these things. But I knew him from The Expanse. Thank you very much.
yeah.
And so I'm.
See it now,
Yeah, it's a direct relation. And so, so I knew him from The Expanse, and so I did the same thing. Write a letter and pray. And so, and in terms of direction of the two of them, I tried to do absolutely as little as possible. We really talked a lot in prep. They both did months and months of prep work on their characters and their roles, and I tried to say we want to suggest. We don't want, if we go too far, it'll become caricature, and so we want to suggest.
Right.
And so that was it.
And this is a question for both of you, both Jeff and Jared. You've played many real-life figures, both of you, throughout your careers, but again, going back to President Reagan, Jeff, I was telling you backstage that there was a very particular way that President Reagan would cock his head when he would, and it was almost, I don't know how you were able to do that so well. I know you're going to say you're an actor, but talk to me about your process in developing your interpretation of Ronald Reagan.
Well, it's hard to play someone so well known, as we both know. Reagan in particular, he's everywhere. We already know who he is, what he sounds like, what he looks like, how he walks, how he talks. So the standard kind of fictional thing, I didn't have that problem in Dumb and Dumber. Make that up.
Came from acting.
To be honest, I took it because I thought I'd fail. I thought it was so hard, and it was. And I tried to do the lines and the voice and the mannerisms at the same time, and I couldn't do it. So it's he's right with Sorkin and Newsroom. You got a lot of lines. We had a lot of lines to learn. So I started it. We shot it in October. I started in April. And I just memorized the whole script first. I got the lines first. That took 3 months because they're not easy lines. It's not easy dialogue.
Yeah.
And I'm not even a Shakespearean actor. I mean, Jared is way beyond me on that. But get the lines and then drop the voice on top of it. There was a lot of YouTube, a lot of, just listening to him. Then you see some of those little ticks. So, well, you see that little stuff come in, and those are like little keys in. And once you can get you to come in, now with the writing and all of that, you can see what he's thinking, what he's feeling. And that's what I hadn't seen it till tonight. And that's what I was blown away by, was how together we were.
Yeah.
When you get, we've worked with a lot of people, and a lot of people who are shitty. We have. But you get in the room with Jared, with JK,
Yeah.
and then here comes Hope. But particularly the two of us, it was together. And we didn't rehearse that much. We ran through some stuff, but it was roll, front of the camera. We shot it in 3.5 weeks. That's like, you're moving. You're moving. But to be able to, you forget the camera, you share it with someone like Jared Harris. And he makes you better. When you work with great actors, not good actors, great actors, they make you better. And that's what we had. That's what I had in him. He was always number one guy.
Jared, same question for you, Jared. Inhabiting such a character, and also it felt to me, and Timothy can weigh in on this as well, that Mikhail Gorbachev operated in a world where every single word mattered. President Reagan has the liberty, he's an American, he can joke, he can riff, but Mikhail Gorbachev, it seemed to me, operates in a world where every word matters. And so how did you prepare yourself for portraying somebody navigating history at such a pivotal moment in the course of human civilization, really? I mean, that's what it was at the end of the day, right?
Well, I didn't have such a high bar as Jeff, because all you had to do is just put that port wine stain on and
We know who you are.
basically. Yeah, so that part was easy. And it wasn't me, that was Ivana. I remember viscerally this happening. I was living in London at the time. I was at drama school, I think. And I remember feeling what was at stake, that this thing they were gonna do something that was gonna change this terrible existential nightmare that we were all living in, not knowing whether or not the world was gonna blow up tomorrow. And so I had that part of the context of the story all sorted for me. Because quite often when you play historical characters, you've got to do a lot of research to try and figure out what was happening at that time and why they were committed and needed to do the things that they wanted to do. Why was this important, So that part was already there. And then, the thing that brought everybody to the table was the script. It was incredibly well written. And although a lot of the speeches are challenging, they're delicious as an actor, because there's so much material there for you to play with, and they're so well written, and so, the tennis match is so clear. I forgot what your question was, but yeah.
but you sort of nailed it, right? Where you're talking about playing a character whose place in the history of these two great countries, these two great. I go back to how consequential this was, not just for the Soviet Union and the United States, but for all the peoples of the world. And you're playing that character, and it began with the words that were written in the script. But Timothy, I want to ask you too, again, to break down a little bit of what Jared is talking about. If there's somebody in the audience, I don't think there's anybody in the audience who doesn't know how significant this moment in history was. Break that down for us. If you had to explain why this was such a pivotal moment and what it led to subsequently between the Soviet Union and the United States, why was this such an important moment?
First of all, it's great to be here and to be with, King George VI and Mikhail Gorbachev and Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain and Ronald Reagan. In 1991, the Soviet Union was the only empire ever to collapse peacefully. No empire in modern history had ever collapsed peacefully. The collapse of the Soviet Union was unpredicted. And this is a story of how people matter. In fact, two people, three. I would say George Herbert Walker Bush also will play an important role in the last year or two. But what makes this story, and I only saw it for the first time because it was just today, before you. The reason this story is so powerful is it is a reminder in the hands of two excellent actors that individuals matter. It is inconceivable for me to imagine two other people engaging each other the way that Gorbachev and Reagan did, with the kind of influence each had. They say only Nixon could have gone to China. Only Reagan could have reduced American strategic forces because he had a generation and a half of credibility on the issue of the Soviet Union. And in the case of Gorbachev, only Gorbachev, among his generation, his cohort of leaders, had the courage to risk everything. And that's why that conversation with Raisa on the boat is so powerful. To risk everything to make his people live better and to make the world a safer place. The idea that two of these people should be on the planet at the same time and together in the North Atlantic is almost impossible to imagine, which is what makes history so interesting and fun. And the two of you inhabited, as Vladimir said, you completely inhabited those characters and drove the story that has been forgotten. I teach, I love teaching, and the one thing that young people don't get about this era is the psychological dimension. It's not like World War II. They'll watch World War II, but they're not interested in the Cold War. Why? Because they didn't understand nuclear terror. These two, in your positions, not only understood it, but were willing to take risks to deal with it. That is astounding, and that's what makes this story so unusual historically and so important to tell.
Although when in the moment it appeared to the world that the summit did not achieve its goals, as we learned subsequently, there were a number of treaties and disarmament treaties that were had between the United States and the Soviet Union. But there's a particular emphasis on SDI. And I remember in school it was called Star Wars, right?
Yeah.
It's what we talk about in Star Wars. And the notion of mutually assured destruction, where deterrence, the way you deter an enemy is through retaliation. And what President Reagan was trying to suggest to Secretary Gorbachev is that with SDI, it's no longer retaliation, it's just defense. But Gorbachev could not come around to seeing that.
No, let me say, we were so lucky that during the Cold War, in both the Kremlin and the White House, we had people who were serious and understood what nuclear weapons meant. And Reagan was the first to publicly say he wanted to eliminate nuclear weapons. And by the way, I remember people criticizing him on the left and the right. They connected it to the fact they thought he wasn't a smart man. But he wasn't the only one. Dwight Eisenhower hated nuclear weapons. John F. Kennedy hated nuclear weapons. In fact, no serious American president had anything but concern about the existence of nuclear weapons. That didn't have to be the case, right? We didn't necessarily have to elect people in the Cold War who were that serious and that committed to our well-being, but we did. And on the Soviet side, we actually, with the exception of Stalin, but he's gone by 1953, we were dealing with people who were equally concerned about what nuclear weapons meant. The one thing we couldn't understand about each other was that we didn't understand that we were afraid of each other. The Soviets were afraid of us. They were always afraid of us. They always knew that we could never compete with them scientifically. That's why SDI was such a problem for Gorby. You have so much mistrust between two empires, if you will, two superpowers. And one superpower will never be able to compete scientifically with the other. Why should they trust that the other, the more technologically superior, will give up that advantage? And on our side, we were afraid. We saw the nature of their society. It was a scary, threatening society that was openly committed to expansion, at least ideological expansion. And reining in our fear took a lot of effort too. So we had two societies that were afraid of each other. And in that kind of environment, war breaks out. And yet it didn't. And that's what makes this story so powerful.
Michael, to that end, I mean, the film is driven by conversation, by diplomacy, the weight of decision-making rather than spectacle, right? There are not a lot of cameras. These two men sitting face to face, almost like a game of chess, but with the best of intentions. I mean, what comes across on the screen are the best of intentions of these men, and we know that through the historical record. How did you as a director build that tension while staying true to the historical record? And how did you as a director determine what to keep in the film and what to perhaps remove or to streamline for a modern audience?
Tough questions.
That's what I do. That's what I do, Jeff.
So in terms of the direction of keeping the tension, the critical factor is obviously the shooting style. Very early shout out to Magdalena, our advisor. That we talked a lot in prep about, I knew it took place in '86, but I wanted to shoot it like a 1970s political thriller. So you see a lot of punch zooms, you see a lot of split screens, things like that to keep the tension in the frame. And then, the other piece of it was the willingness, I would say, of these two to endure incredibly tight lenses. You want to really get in there. And so we did that, and it was all about keeping the tension between the two of them, playing all the reactions. We had this conversation earlier about how most of the time you're cutting away from reactions instead of living with them. And so seeing what that chess match in which every single piece of paper and every single word mattered between the two of them. And so that was the primary part of it. And then, the other piece was trying to figure out, so I came up in TV and you're writing and producing in television, and this was my first time directing. But I learned in television that you had to kind of take off your writer hat and put on your producer hat and look at it and see how you can do it on time and on budget, right? Well, this was an additional thing of putting on the directing hat and figuring that out. And so a lot of the time it was about, I wish I was an auteur. I wish I was Tarantino and could just wear all the hats at once. I can't do that. So I had to write the script, take off the hat, put on the directing hat, look at the script, go, what the hell is this writer thinking? Give a bunch of notes, take that off, writer hat back on, scream at the director, take that off, put the producer hat on and say...
Scream at the director.
The director, exactly. And just keep juggling those hats. That was really it.
Jeff, we talked about your portrayal of President Reagan, but what did you, I guess my question would be, in preparing to portray him, what did you learn about him, his personality, his life, his closeness with Nancy Reagan? I love how both of these men rely on their wives for advice, for guidance, and you show that in the film. What did you learn about President Reagan that you perhaps didn't already know before you?
Well, devoted to her. Devoted was the word that kept popping up. Smarter than I thought. He used, as an actor, he used that charm, that kind of able to, hold a crowd and all that. He used that. He wanted to, I learned that he wanted to, it seemed to me, establish something, get through to him, to get through to Gorbachev. And I think he was searching for the goodness in him. Didn't anticipate that. Assumed bullshit and bluster, I think, is one of the early lines. And there was some crack in this guy, and he I think by the end of it, I thought that there were moments, not always, but moments where they could be friends. There were just moments of that, much like the tear down the wall. This is like the first inning of a baseball game, first inning of tear down the wall. But it was just cracks. It was the beginning of the end of the Cold War in that room. And it was kind of fascinating to, I mean, we were in the house, in the room, in the chairs.
Yeah.
And what we did, and what I saw tonight, was that you got inside them. We were in them. We were becoming them, inhabiting them. That was the truth. Suggest them. But then you were pulled into us because we were in. It was quite the magic trick. I thought. I was blown away. To be honest, I didn't expect this.
Reykjavik is one of the very few summits for which we have almost complete records from both sides, which is why, in a sense, you could both be pulled in, because we have an unusual, I mean, Michael used it brilliantly, but we have an unusually rich, so we have unusually rich source material. So often in these meetings, we have to assume or use memoirs or what have you, but in this case, you had the actual words. And I think that must have helped draw you into the complexity of this chess match.
I mean, Jared, one of the things that I thought as I was watching the film is how Gorbachev is navigating this conversation with President Reagan while also carrying, it felt like the weight and the pressure of the politics back in his home country were incredibly ponderous upon him, more so than even President Reagan. How did you, as an actor, communicate those competing forces without having to state them directly? I mean, we're watching you. We can see the you're the only during those scenes. You're the only one who actually slams his fist on the table twice, at least, to my
Yeah, well, that was something that Soviet leaders were famous for doing.
right. Yeah. It wasn't a shoe this time, but
which Brendan said that this has absolutely happened. I mean, it seemed as though when you do that, you're losing your argument at that point. So it was but it's a different mentality. I remember when we were out there, I met somebody who worked in the television station in Iceland, and right after the summit had ended, Gorbachev had arranged for a satellite signal to broadcast back to the Soviet Union the outcome of this meeting. And when he's sitting in the studio and the guy's setting up the cameras and everything, he jokes and goes, "Listen, sometimes this doesn't work, we lose the signal, but I hope it's going to be all right." And Gorbachev goes, "If the signal fails, I'll be sent to Siberia and I'll be killed." The stakes were that high for him. And he was taking a huge risk, there was also something. I remember when you start to do all this stuff, you read everything you can read, and there's biographies on him, and there's records of his speeches, which you were rewarded in the Soviet Union for the length of your speech. These things they're like 40 or 50 pages long, talking about farming and stuff like that, in production and stuff. But what came across was that the Soviet Union was going to collapse economically, and that they could afford to build these weapons at the same pace as the United States. But whatever it was that the Americans were going to come up with, SDI, they weren't going to be able to compete with that. They couldn't afford it. So they had to end it. So that, and the desire was to redirect all of the resources they were putting into building these stupid weapons, pointless weapons that could never be used, into making the life of the people better, which would then preserve the system. So, I mean, but, you sit down and you sort of start to understand all of that, and then you get an idea of why these people have come to the table. And there was two other things that I remember. One was there's a photograph of the wherever the service was when Raisa dies, and she died before him, and he's at the funeral, and he's is, you know, he's collapsed over the coffin, weeping and sobbing. So, you know, that makes him seem like a human being, you know, like he's rather than one of these stoic Soviet leaders. And then the other thing was, you know, I told you this, there were two things that brought these two people to the table. And one was the Chernobyl accident. And Gorbachev realized at that point that was a small explosion, you know, it was localized. And that the idea, and they couldn't handle that. They couldn't deal with the repercussions of that. And the idea that you could survive a nuclear exchange was ridiculous. And then there was a TV show called The Day After that ABC put out, and Reagan watched it. And he realized this is a fantasy that we can survive a nuclear exchange. And so that's what brought these two people to the table.
I recall, how many of you were in school when that Day After came out, and they ran it in schools, right? We had to like sit there, and I was here in New York City. We were still in the 1970s and 80s, ducking under desks in preparation. And we saw this movie, and we're like, why are we doing that? We're gonna die. Yeah. So Michael, just to wrap up the discussion on SDI, because I think it's interesting. In a way, as I was watching this, I thought to myself, well, SDI, the way that Gorbachev envisioned it, never actually came to be. It was folded up by President Clinton into the Missile Defense Agency. Was Gorbachev right in the notion that the president mentions the sword of Damocles, but if you have a shield, you change the nature of what a sword can do.
Yeah.
Right? And that was Gorbachev's fear.
Yeah.
Should President Reagan have agreed to, in your mind, having talked to Secretary Shultz, did Secretary Shultz say to you that, you know what, maybe the president should have agreed to not test it other than in a laboratory?
You know, he never said that, but what was fascinating to me was that he felt as though Reagan came at it from a different kind of place, a different point of view, which was that yes, it was a negotiating tool, right? Yes, I think that all those things were true. But he seems to, at least from Shultz and others around him and everything I've read, that he seemed to have a deep and abiding moral sense that the American people, having invented the atomic bomb, owed it to the world to negate that in a way. And so it was this kind of profound belief, I think only probably possible from someone who had lived through World War II and through that, to see the world that way. And so I'm saying this as somebody who did not grow up and understand all the machinations of those things, but it seems to me that it may have been impossible from a moral standpoint for him to give it up, because he believed that the American people owed it to the world to help negate the thing that they had invented. And so when he says, I'm going to give it to you, to Gorbachev, that's in the transcripts. Everyone can go on the National Security Archives and read that. He offers it to him for free, because I think it wasn't about us versus you or them or whatever. It was at his core, he felt like we owed it to the world to get rid of these things. And that was his way of doing it.
The end of the Cold War was a process. These were two men who did not trust each other, who had to travel some distance. And I think Reykjavík made it possible. But it doesn't matter that it didn't happen at Reykjavík. Without Reykjavík, it wouldn't have happened. A year later, these two leaders were able to reach agreements that wouldn't have been possible before Reykjavík. So yes, SDI ended the possibility for a glorious triumph in the North Atlantic. But SDI, in the end, the United States decoupled the whole question of reductions of strategic weapons from SDI. George Herbert Walker Bush did. So in the end, this didn't stop the dismantling of nuclear arsenals. The one thing that didn't happen is nuclear zero. But we don't know if nuclear zero would have been possible, even if these two leaders had agreed on SDI, because there were so many forces. Look, Ronald Reagan, when he went back to Washington, had a difficult conversation with the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Now, they We have civilian leadership, thank God, in this country. But they were saying, Mr. President, you really didn't believe, you really weren't seeking nuclear zero, were you? So all I'm suggesting is that Reykjavik was a necessary step and an accelerant to the end of the Cold War. And so the fact that SDI made the end of that particular chapter a little bitter didn't affect world history, because in the end, the Soviet Union collapsed, the Cold War ended, and we became a much safer world.
Briefly. Yeah, I mean,
Well, it's a different generation.
yeah.
And I want to touch on that, Jared, before we wrap up. But Michael, one other question on the script, and perhaps this is in the transcript. President Reagan, famously, we all know President Reagan was very proud of his Irish-American roots several times in the script. What I also appreciated is how in the interactions that the Soviets and the Americans were having, they would point out the moral failings of each society over, whether you're quoting Life, Liberty, and the Pursuit of Happiness written by a slaveholder. And I thought it was interesting that several times throughout the discussion, the negotiations with Secretary Gorbachev, the president says, we are a nation of immigrants. He was very proud of that.
Yeah.
Was that in the transcript? And
Yeah, that's in the transcripts. That's in the transcripts. The Rostropovich stuff is in the transcripts. It's quite striking, to read it and see it. And I think that, the stat that's in the film, the 1 out of 8, that was something he referenced, I think, I'd have to go back and look, but I think 3 or 4 different times over different summits to Gorbachev, of saying, if you count Ukraine, you count Latvia, and you count all the socialist republics, to America, 1 in 8 would trace their lineage back. And so, that was a very potent thing to him, that he felt like, it was in the press nearly daily that you had refuseniks who couldn't get out. And so I think that was a very important thing to him.
So to the point that Timothy, you were making, and that Jared, you sort of added to, and we've got the former United States ambassador to the United Nations here, the former National Security Advisor is also here during the first Trump administration. It's watching this film, it's impossible for anybody to watch it and not think about today's geopolitical landscape. What kind of conversation, first to you, Michael, do you think that this film will spark? What kind of conversation would you like it to spark?
Well, I hope, I use this word a lot, I guess, in my vocabulary, but what I want, I guess, for the audience to walk out of the theater talking about is what's possible. I think that, we live in a very different world from this time. This was, 40 years ago, this October, and it was a bipolar world. It was divided in these 2 spheres. And now we live in a multipolar world where there is China that we have to deal with. We have, the Ukraine situation, all these different situations in the world. So I think it's a little bit of a false narrative to draw a direct parallel. What I do think is universal, though, and what I hope and pray and want for audiences to walk out of the theater with is what is possible. Is that it is never a bad time to talk to an adversary, and it is, if you can find a partner, and that's the key factor. They found partners, but if you can find a partner who you can trust, then anything is possible. I think, I was very young when this event happened, but one of my visceral memories as a child was that I was watching ABC News on a very scratchy screen on a farm in South Carolina when the wall fell. And I turned around and I looked at my parents, and I couldn't understand as a child what was on their face. And I get emotional thinking about this. It wasn't until I had my own children that what I realized I was seeing on their face was relief. That they had been living with what everyone lived through, what you mentioned about this nuclear terror, for so long, that what they saw when they saw the wall fall was relief. And so that's something that I hope that audiences gain from this, which is anything is possible if we just can find the right partner and we can have dialogue.
Timothy, would you like to add to that? Because you and I were talking a little bit about this earlier.
Public service matters. Serious people matter. Try to walk in the shoes of your adversary to figure out what they need. You don't give it to them if they're seeking to destroy you. But be open to the possibility that they're afraid of you just as you're afraid of them. I would want people to view this movie and understand that that was a time of giants, but it doesn't mean we can't have giants in the future.
Jeff, you were especially emotional at the end of the film because this is you've watched it today for the first time in its entirety. What were you feeling as you watched the
How smart it is. And we're not as smart as we used to be. And that matters. I mean, you mentioned serious people. We're still capable of it. I think those people still exist. And, again, there's goodness in everybody, almost everybody. And that's important. That's what you have to seek. You have to chase that. Human nature is what it is. It's the good angels, the bad angels, or the lesser angels. We still have the chance to do what these guys did in '86. We just have to get the people that want to do it.
Jared, you've played characters that have stood at the crossroads of history before, right? We mentioned George VI, even Lane. The era, no, but even the era that he inhabited was a very unique one in American history. That age of Mad Men. It wasn't just about Madison Avenue advertisers and marketing execs. It was about the world that we were living in the United States, and of course. I wonder for you in playing this character, there's even like little moments when you're mentioned the script references Margaret Thatcher or Helmut Kohl, right? And I wonder for you what that is like having played so many of these types of roles, what you think about those characters and the world that we inhabit now, the real world.
Yeah. Well, just briefly, Mad Men was about selling the American dream to America. The lie of it. I think that and apropos of what you guys are saying, that character matters, and that's why I think you're putting your trust in people who have demonstrated something that is a sincere belief or a sincere desire that you believe is not just hucksterism, that there's a goal that they're engaged in that you can support, In terms of playing all those characters, I mean, that's just lucky, really. And I feel lucky to have been involved in this project. I feel lucky to have had the opportunity to sit across that table from Jeff and learn from a master.
Michael, before we wrap up, the title, The Brink of War, speaks to just how closely the world came to catastrophe, and it wasn't the first time. I mean, we'd seen it before during the Cuban Missile Crisis. We even saw it during the erection of the wall in Berlin, even the 1973 Yom Kippur War. There were a lot of crossed wires between the Soviets and the United States during that period of time.
And Able Archer in '83.
Exactly, Able Archer was another very, very big one.
Yeah.
Perhaps people may not be that familiar with, where the Russians actually thought we were about to launch a strike.
Yeah.
What were you trying to say ultimately about leadership during moments of crisis when the world could find itself on the brink of war?
Well, I think the first thing is that they had to be very, very clear about their positions. I think one of the things that, in going back and reading all this about Able Archer, whether the Cuban Missile Crisis or what have you, is that we came so close so many times that a lot of it seems like it comes down to luck. That we there's apocryphal stories in books, more books than I can mention, that talk about colonels and lieutenants and very junior ranked military people who see something doesn't look right and choose not to press the button. And so as the command and control systems evolved over the Cold War, and so it became farther up the food chain, which we depict, which is Shultz's memory of the two nuclear footballs facing each other. That was his memory of like, oh, wow, this is all right here. So, but those command and control systems early in the Cold War did not exist, right? They were really down to the lieutenant in the silo on the truck and the mobile launchers. So part of what I wanted to try to convey is that when the opportunity arises, that you can avoid something like war. In this case, that is an actual quote that Reagan said in the room. It's like, we too can decide if there's peace or war. That when that moment arises, if you both are very clear about your positions and you can establish that with clarity and with trust, then negotiation becomes possible. That's really it. But if you come in and aren't sure, and a lot of times we see in history people aren't sure about the intentions of someone else, that's when war starts.
Did Secretary Shultz feel that, and this is a question perhaps you're best suited to answer, the first one, it's two parts. Do you think that they liked each other, Reagan and Gorbachev? And do you think ultimately they grew to trust each other? Because what you're talking about is oftentimes what happens in these types of negotiations is there's a lack of trust between the two parties. Do you think that at the end of the day?
That happened here at Reykjavík. That trust that you're talking about happened here. I think the friendship came later. I think it was genuine. Mm-hmm. But Shultz's, it was quite interesting. Jared and I talked about this a little bit during prep, but this film is mostly told from the American perspective, right up until the last 5 minutes. And what the sleight of hand is that it shifts to the Soviet perspective. That what happened at Reykjavik was the Americans walked out and realized we don't have a deal, ball game's over, we don't know, Shultz was despondent, he didn't know, he thought it was a failure. But what happened was Gorbachev went out immediately, as Jared told the story, and gave a press conference, said, this is great, everything worked out. And so he had a personal motivation for that, but he also had the realization that a bond was formed. And that misunderstanding between it lasted all the way to what JK does at the end of the film. That actually happened to Shultz. Years later, Gorbachev came out to visit Shultz at Stanford. And even then, Shultz said, what happened? We were at the coldest point, we were gonna go to war, and then it was over in 3 years. And he literally said one word, and that was Reykjavik. So that trust happened in this room, and the friendship, I think, followed from that.
Mm-hmm. And lastly, just a note on the production. I mean, you chose to film at the very house that those two world leaders conducted these negotiations in. I love the little detail of Pete Sousa, who is the current White House, retired White House photographer, also being name checked. But also just again, going back to as a young teenager, seeing Raisa on the cover of Time magazine with those fur hats. You nailed, why was that important for you to be there, to shoot there?
I just, number one, I didn't think it could be replicated. It didn't seem possible to replicate it. And the second part of it was really for the Icelandic people. The Icelandic people, every single person you meet who is old enough to remember it has a story about it. Our production designer came in and told a story about how he was with his dad walking down the street and a limousine in a motorcade pulled up and the window comes down and a bald man said, hello, little boy, in English, and kept going. And his dad goes, that was Gorbachev. So everybody you meet has a story about our production services. Eli is here in the room. He has a story. Everybody you meet has a story. And so the Icelandic people, I think it was important to them as much as it was to us.
And we've got some of the founders of Angel here. Did they at all blink when you said, this is where I want to shoot in Reykjavik?
Well, the thing, Angel, we did this independently. Angel came in and
we had no one.
We had no one. Yeah, it was just us. No, we had, this was financed independently. We're very fortunate that SK Global and 2521 financed us. And then Angel, what happened with Angel was, I believe, and I'm thankful to all of you for being here, because I so believe in cinema and that it is one of our last communal spaces. We're all on our phones now. But the cinema and the theater are perhaps our last communal spaces as a community. A lot of the Rotaries and the Lions Clubs and those things have gone away. But the cinema still remains. And so what happened with Angel Studios was they came in and made us an offer, as you heard at the top, to put us in 2,000 screens across the country. And I'm so grateful to them because that means that everything.
That was going to be my last question, but since I'm a journalist, you made me think of a last question that I have for Tim, which is what you just mentioned there, Michael, about the age that we live in now. I mean, Timothy, given what we have today that exists in the form of technology, the internet, smartphones, social media, it would strike me that this summit was easier to conduct back in 1986 than it would perhaps be today in 2026? Or am I being, even though I'm not a boomer, maybe I'm talking like one. I don't know.
I've studied enough politicians to know how not to answer a question. Answer a question that I want to. I just want to say something about George Shultz. That I got to know him, and he was very helpful to me. George Shultz was a guardrail. And some of you may know that I was the federal director of the Richard Nixon Library, the first federal director. And George Shultz is the man who said to President Nixon that you cannot implement the enemies list, and said, if you sick the power of the federal government on people you consider to be your enemies, you will undermine our economy and the trust between the American people and this government. And he said that. We have the documents to prove it, and Richard Nixon says on the tapes, who the hell does this guy think he is? Does he think he's in his job because he has blue eyes? George Shultz was he should be a hero. He was what we called a good government Republican who cared about the nature of our constitutional order. He was so good at his job, the president didn't fire him, but the president said no. There were hundreds of names on the enemies list, and a man named John Dean passed it to the head of the IRS and said, go after these people. And the head of the IRS didn't want to do it. He was a conservative Republican. He thought, this is terrible. This is not what we do here. And he went to George Shultz and he said, Mr. Secretary, what do I do? And he said, don't do it. And he said, well, what if John Dean comes back to me and says the president wants it? He says, you tell John Dean he has a problem with me. And if the president wants me to do this, he'd better tell me. So George Shultz, with a different president, was one of those guardrails. With the president we saw, George Shultz helped Ronald Reagan, who was a very decent man, be a better self. So George Shultz was one of those incredibly selfless people who makes the world work. And I just was touched to see his portrait at the end of this picture. I want to say one more thing about George Shultz. When we wanted to put in the museum for everybody, American, anybody else, to see George Shultz telling the story of saying no to a president, because he did it for the National Archives. The family, the Nixon family, didn't want that and put a lot of pressure on my bosses to prevent that from happening. So they set a bar. They said I had to go back to everybody whose interview I wanted to use in the museum and get their approval. We had deeds. I didn't really have to, but my bosses said I had to do this. So I communicated with George Shultz. He said, of course you're going to use it. I don't care. Go ahead. That's the kind of person he was. So this is not just a story, Mr. Simmons isn't here, but this is not just a story of two great leaders, but it's also a story of great staffers and a very famous man named George Shultz. So that's not the answer to your question, but I want.
It's a good one, though. It's a good way to wrap it up. It's a good way to wrap up the discussion. Jeff Daniels, Timothy Naftali, Michael, Garrett, thank you all very much. Thank you all for being here. Appreciate it. Thank you.
You've got your phone.